The views and opinions expressed on today's show are solely those of the individuals speaking and do not necessarily reflect the official positions of the American Solidarity Party. The official party platform can be found under the About Us page on the American Solidarity Party website, solidarity-party.org. You're listening to The Pelican Brief, the official podcast of the American Solidarity Party, a show dedicated to promoting the common good on common ground through common sense. I'm your host, Bill Fleming. Today, we have a special edition of The Pelican Brief that is being published outside of our regular schedule. My guest today is Mark Galli. Mark is an author and editor who recently retired from his position as editor-in-chief of Christianity Today. Mark joins me today to discuss the importance of moral leadership in politics. Thank you for joining me today, Mark.
Glad to be with you.
Can you tell us a little bit about yourself for our listeners who may not be familiar with you and your work?
Yeah, well, I was editor-in-chief of Christianity Today, the leading evangelical magazine, one could argue, in the United States, if not in the world. That doesn't mean it represents all evangelicals, but it represents a significant portion. Anyway, I retired from that position in January, and I've been retired since, but I did that. I was editor-in-chief for 7 years, managing editor for another 14 before that. I've been in Christian journalism for about 30 years altogether. Before that, I was a Presbyterian pastor. And so I've been embedded in the evangelical movement more or less since I went forward at an altar call at age 13. So it's been some 50 years, half a century. It's hard to believe.
You've been publicly critical of what you've described as Donald Trump's public morality. Can you walk us through the difference between private and public morality?
Well, private morality, I guess, would concern things that, in a sense, the American people in general have no business. It's none of their business, whether he takes the Lord's name in vain or even if he, has a bad habit like watching pornography or getting angry with his wife. I mean, we're all subject to those temptations and sins, and they don't necessarily impact our work, whether that's work as an editor or a grocery clerk or a policeman or a president. And so those are kind of like off limits. When I make the argument that a president or a political leader needs to be a person of character, I don't mean to imply that they have to somehow have a certain sanctity, a personal holiness before they can enter the office. But public morality is when your morals and ethics intersect with your duties as a public person. And again, that has to do with whether you're a police officer, a governor, treasurer of a church, editor of a magazine, or president of the United States. So that would obviously include taking bribes or outright lying to the press or to a federal prosecutor. But it also includes your behavior and demeanor as a human being in that office. So in the case of Mr. Trump, his the thing that I've been most concerned about is his use of language and how he uses it to denigrate people and despise people and to create enemies of people and to denounce people. These are all things that moral traditions, including Christianity, would say are deeply troubling. If a human being cannot control their tongue, cannot speak civilly with their enemies, that's a pretty serious moral issue.
So if we were to apply that framework to Bill Clinton, would you say the reason that his affair became an issue of public morality was because Monica Lewinsky was a member of the staff and that he perjured himself about it?
Yes, I would say that's definitely true. I mean, I suppose theoretically, and I'm speaking theoretically, if he were to have an affair with someone who was not on his staff and not related to anything he's doing in his job, I suppose I could argue that that's in one sense a moral failing It shows that he has an inability to keep vows to his wife, but that doesn't necessarily impinge on his ability to govern. So I could even say that's a matter of private morality. But when it comes to a member of the staff and then lying about it uh, to people who are looking into it from the government, yeah, that's public morality that's a problem. Uh-huh.
And so I know there may not be a very clear cut answer to this, but at what point, in your opinion, can we say that the president is unfit to lead due to his moral character?
Yeah, you're right. I mean, in the end, that's a prudential judgment because many of my friends who agree with my analysis of the problems with his character say they still think he should be in office. What he stands for, his policies outweigh his character. And I think where we disagree then is how important is the character of a president in comparison to his policies. Um, I think the case, obviously, is pretty clear that Mr. Trump's character, especially how he exacerbates. I don't think he created, but he exacerbates a divisiveness in our society that makes it really difficult for people on opposite sides of a political, spectrum to not. It makes it difficult for them to talk to one another. It makes it even difficult for them to respect one another. We've gotten to the point now where polls have shown that Republicans not only think Democrats are wrong, they think they're somehow just simply evil, and vice versa. Um, and I think he's contributed to that instead of being a person who tries to uh, lessen that type of divisiveness. And I think that's a serious political and social problem in the United States of America. That he may not be able to solve our divisiveness, but he certainly has the responsibility to try to keep it to a bare minimum. It seems to me, and he's not even trying to do that. And if you don't have that, if you don't have civil discourse, you can't have a democracy. So what he's doing in his tweets and in his speeches, and just in this one area, is unraveling the fabric of democracy in America, which strikes me as a fairly serious thing. Yeah.
How much of that has to do with also the trust in institutions, whether those are federal institutions or media institutions? Because one of the things that I'm hearing in that response about, not being able to even talk to each other, we can't even agree on some of basic facts.
Yeah, that's what's really interesting. And that is pervading our society at all sorts of levels. Uh, I was talking with my one of my daughters who wants to take a trip to the Yucatan in uh, in the winter, and she noted someone noted to her that there was this report that from one of the military branches that flying on planes, even when they're crowded, is relatively safe in terms of COVID. And her first reaction it was, I don't know if I can trust this. So that's the state we're in. Whether it has to do with politics or medicine or anything, our first reaction is who's saying it, why are they saying it, and can I trust it? I'm not sure Donald Trump's responsible for that, but again, I think he is one of many people who exacerbates that problem, which, as you well know, if there is no trusted source of facts in America, it's going to be very difficult to have a democracy.
Did you anticipate the pushback that resulted from the editorial, or was that something that kind of blindsided you?
Well, what blindsided me was the way it went viral. I knew that in our community we'd get some pushback. Although I will say, I mean, one thing people don't recognize is that for all the pushback, there was a lot of public pushback. There was also a lot of public adulation. Uh, Christianity Today lost 3,000 subscribers within a few hours, but over the next few days, it gained 9,000. So uh, it was controversial for sure, and I knew it would be controversial in our movement. I did not anticipate that anyone outside our movement would care or read it. Obviously, my the quality of my judgment in that matter was proven terribly wrong. I still marvel. Every once in a while, I start thinking about what happened for those few days after the editorial, and I'm just stunned at what took place. Yeah.
I know a lot of our listeners will agree with you about President Trump, and some of them may even be voting for or may have already voted for Joe Biden. Many Christians will not be supporting Biden. They may choose to not vote at all. They may vote for a third party candidate like Brian Carroll. In your opinion, is it disqualifying if a candidate supports an immoral policy? And if so, what is your framework for how we should evaluate whether an immoral policy is severe enough to warrant a disqualification of that candidate?
Yeah. Well, that's again that pushing that envelope to that degree. I mean, it's a really good question. Obviously, uh, that is a matter of prudential judgment that would require looking at the specifics of the case in question. So many evangelicals who are fervently pro-life refuse to vote for Joe Biden precisely because he seems to be pro-choice for all intents and purposes. Um, but for me, I can't think of a candidate's position. I'd have to do some thinking. First of all, I'm not much of a political person, in spite of what my reputation is. My argument about Trump is mostly grounded in morals and in theology, but I can't think of a president whose policies, one policy or another, I would consider immoral. So when it comes to Donald Trump, the way he's treated immigrants is to me clearly immoral and despicable, really. Um, so I mean, he claims to be pro-life, but he certainly isn't pro-life when it comes to people who are not from this country and want to get into this country for desperate reasons. So first of all, you have to come to the polling booth recognizing each party or each candidate that you're choosing between probably offers is supporting some policy that you as an individual might consider not only wrong, but you might even consider deeply immoral. So our choices when we enter the polling booth are not the choice between good and evil, and we have to do a rather, disturbing calculus at that point. What does this person stand for? What do I like about him? Is it worth voting for him or her despite this one or 2 points? Because inevitably we have to vote for someone in spite of 1 or 2 points. Sometimes those are just policy issues, but sometimes they're issues of that you think cross the line into morality. Um, so I'm not sure that answers your question, but so in terms of this election, I can understand why evangelicals don't want to vote for Biden. I also understand why they might consider his views on immigration and the environment and other things might counteract his views on, or might allow them to vote for him despite his pro-choice views. I can also say, I mean, I think it was a newspaper in, I think it was in Germany, wanted me to write an op-ed on why evangelicals should vote for Joe Biden, and I had to remind them that in my criticisms of Trump, I'm not staking out a position of what people should do about the fact that he is a desperately immoral person of very low quality, public character quality. Um, you might want to take that as a sign that you should just pray more fervently for him, or you should try to address him personally and get him to change his ways, or you might vote for Joe Biden, or you might vote for a third party candidate like your candidate from your party, or you might not vote at all. What people do with that information, I don't have a strong opinion about. What I do have a strong opinion about is that especially my fellow evangelicals recognize it and be able to acknowledge the serious flaws in President Trump's character and how damaging that is to the nation. What they do with that afterwards, I'm less concerned. I just would like to see some real frank honesty about what we're seeing before our very eyes.
One thing that you touched upon was the apparent contradiction between being pro life while supporting Donald Trump's anti immigrant policies. What are your thoughts on whole life politics, or what's referred to as the consistent life ethic?
Well, I think it's a fine ethic in the ideal, but it's also there are cases where it's just difficult to determine what in fact is a pro-life stance in any given moment. So, for example, I mean, the most dramatic example would be international conflict. You have a nation that's being either oppressed or attacked by a violent and oppressive regime. On one hand, you could argue you should not intervene violently or militarily because that would mean to sacrifice human life at some point. Uh, on the other hand, I can see a good argument saying you better intervene, otherwise a lot of innocent people are going to die. Yes, there will be some life loss, but it's better than having this nation subjected to an oppression and violence that could go on for decades. So I don't think the consistent life ethic is necessarily a a perfect formula for deciding a political issue, every single political issue down the line. A lot of it again comes down to um, a prudential judgment about, in this particular case, what will in fact uh, be the best good in the long run. So I can see there being disagreements about, for example, environmental policy. Uh, how exactly do we go about ensuring the quality of our environment? Uh, People are going to have different views about that. Uh, but both of them are striving for a better environment, in theory, anyway. One can even see that about immigration policy. I mean, the fact that I am very disturbed with his immigration policy doesn't mean I want a pro-life position would mean you just open the borders and allow anyone and everyone in at will. That would be to sacrifice the quality of life for many Americans. Many Americans would lose jobs. It would be, it could be a catastrophe in terms of overcrowding of schools and all sorts of things, and it would could lead to fracturing in America as too many people are allowed in before they are assimilated to the country. So whether we let in 100,000 immigrants a year, or 200,000, or a half a million, that's a prudential judgment that you kind of have to sit down and weigh the pros and cons of each of those. It's clear to me that trying to get the number down to zero is just unacceptable. Uh, so there you go. That would be an example.
One thing we touched upon a little earlier is that some people will make the argument that being of good moral character is not an essential quality for the president. They may believe the president is similar to being a corporate executive at a private firm, and what matters is the results that are delivered and not the character of the executive himself. How would you respond to this argument, and why is the moral character a critical quality that we need our elected political leaders to have?
Well, I would even, yeah, this bottom line mentality of as long as you get results, it doesn't matter. That is such a nefarious and frankly evil argument that could just about justify anything. Uh, but even a corporate leader, let's say a corporate leader has an affair with his administrative assistant, and that gets known in the company. That I think what people don't recognize is how deeply that sabotages the morale of that corporation, and how much more likely it is for other executives to start having affairs with fellow employees, and how that whole way of living and being in a corporation could destabilize the company's morale, and therefore eventually its ability to deliver a product efficiently and economically. The same goes true, of course, with the president of the United States. If he or she consistently violates some ethical principle, what that teaches something to the rest of the nation, that this sort of thing doesn't matter. And if more and more people think this sort of thing doesn't matter, they're going to start doing the same sorts of things. Uh, and that the reason why the major religions, Christianity, Judaism, Islam, Hinduism, tend to have the same basic moral structure, uh, is because they've learned from experience that if a society, everything from a family to a community to an entire nation doesn't abide by these, or doesn't strive to abide by these, it leads to a kind of chaos in the country in which justice is impossible to pursue. So, yeah, the public character there ought to be at least a modicum of virtue in our leaders. They don't have to be saints, but they at least should be people who look to be striving to do the right thing. And when they do the wrong thing publicly, they're at least able to own up to it.
How do we navigate evaluating the character of an individual in a pluralistic society in which many people may not share our moral values? I know you mentioned already that there is some base level that we all do tend to agree on and that is required for a functioning society. But peripherally to that, are those values not as significant, like in terms of things that may not be as consequential for the society?
Well, again, in some sense, that's a moving target. And we have a recent example of that. I would say 20 years ago, if a public official had said, I am gay, uh, that would have, in most people's minds, disqualified him or her from public office. They would say, this person is confused, either confused sexually or they are immoral, just plain outright immoral sexually. And that says something about their character that I wouldn't trust them to hold a public office. Of course, that opinion is completely flipped. And uh, even though there are a small number of conservative Christians, especially, who would still agree with that, most of us say, okay, one's sexual proclivities, one's sexual practices in their home and in their private life don't don't seem to bear on don't seem to bear on public on their public behavior. Part of the reason for that is we know of a lot of representatives and senators and others who have come out and said they are gay, and yet they seem to be able to perform their activities in a way that's upright and all sorts of other ways. So at one level, again, every religious person would have to make a decision about what are the specific moral issues that I think are at play here. And I think most Christians have come to the conclusion, okay, are we really, especially conservative Christians like me, we do think that sexual relations outside the bounds of a committed marriage between a man and a woman are fundamentally immoral, and they're not countenanced by God. On the other hand, we live in a society full of sinners, including us. And so we have to figure out, how do we live with people who disagree with us about something that we think is as basic as that. And of course, the law of the love of a neighbor, and the law of charity, and the law of even loving your enemies, your political enemies, comes into play.
And you mentioned the idea that if the president um, kind of sets the standard and says these behaviors are okay, uh, with regard to that particularly, is there any risk of scandal with regard to the president's personal or private life?
Yeah. So I talked earlier about if the president had an affair with a woman who was not connected with his day to day work life, or the affair could in no way be said to impinge on his day to day duties. If that was discovered, I still think it would be a serious problem in the American public, for the American public. Um, Here's the thing about Americans: even though our sexual standards have, in a sense, loosened up quite dramatically in the last 20 years, so that now it includes not only heterosexual marriage but gay marriage, Americans are still insistent that once you've made a public commitment to another human being, man or woman, in something like marriage or resembling marriage, they expect you to honor that. And if you don't, that's a serious mark against you. Um, so I think, from a purely political point of view, I might not say a president's affair with a private individual affects his office. The public, the public perception and respect for him will have dropped dramatically, and that could affect his ability to get things done. So I may be backtracking a little bit on that opening illustration. I would need to think about that some more.
This episode will be published before Election Day. We often hear debates about whether one should vote for the quote-unquote lesser evil or vote their conscience. Do you have any advice for individuals who are feeling conflicted about how they're considering voting?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, in one sense, we're always voting for the lesser evil. That is to say, there's always something about each candidate that we're not, or each party that we're going to find disturbing, either politically or ethically. So, we live in a fallen world, and we have to make the best choices that are available to us, and sometimes that requires us to kind of weigh the balances and do the best we can. I think one of the things I was most disturbed about when I wrote my editorial was, and it was really written not to any evangelical supports Trump, because I get that some people felt backed into a corner between a rock and a hard place, between having to vote for Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump, and they went to the voting booth with their, holding their nose, so to speak. I was really concerned about that group of evangelicals who actually talk about Donald Trump in messianic terms. They talk about him as literally the salvation of America. When they pray for him, as they did at the Trump rally for Evangelicals for Trump rally last January, they say in their prayer that he sits at the right hand of the Father, which is a phrase which is generally reserved for Jesus. And sometimes I suppose you'll see that sort of thing on the left, although it's more prominent now on the right, where this person is not just a candidate who has policies who I need to weigh. This candidate is a messianic figure now. And that's, for the Christian, that's just the simple word for that is idolatry. And that's one of the things I'm most concerned about.
So you mentioned that you retired from Christianity Today back in January. Do you have any new projects that you're currently working on that you would like to share with our listeners?
Yeah, I mean, I continue to publish something called the Galli Report, in which I link to stories that I find interesting or insightful. Some of them might have to do with cultural or political things that are going on, but I generally try to pick things that transcend the current controversies of the moment, although I'll include an analysis of a current controversy now and then. I figure they get plenty of editorials about controversies day to day if they're looking for them. I'm just looking for stuff that transcends that. The other thing that many people aren't aware is that I was confirmed into the Roman Catholic Church in September. This has nothing to do with my editorial or my politics. It's been a long journey, but I am writing a book to explain my conversion because there's many people who have followed me for years, and I figure that I owe them an explanation of what the heck's going on. But as I like to say, I don't really believe I've left evangelicalism in one sense, because I still love Jesus. I still love Scripture. I still want to tell people about Jesus. I've been nurtured in that movement very positively. It's a movement with deep flaws, but what movement isn't? So I kind of consider myself an evangelical Catholic, but that's been a pretty important shift in my life, obviously.
All right, Mark, thank you for joining me. I appreciate you taking the time today.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed today's episode, please share this podcast with your friends and family and subscribe so that you never miss an episode. Our next regularly scheduled episode will be released next Monday, November 9th. Tune in to hear my conversation with Skylar Kovich, the National Chair of the American Solidarity Party.